The shot echoed like the crack of doom. Glass exploded from the bank teller's window, spraying the dusty floor with glittering shrapnel. A woman screamed a high, thin sound, swallowed by the thunder of a second gunshot. Jacob hit the floor, the instincts of a decade serving as a U.S. Marshal kicking in long before his conscious mind caught up. He rolled behind an overturned writing desk, the worn mahogany groaning as a stray bullet chewed a path through its surface. Dust and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder filled his nostrils, a scent he once knew as well as his own name. The town of Redemption had been his sanctuary for 5 years, a quiet place to let the ghosts of his past fade into the relentless sun. Now chaos had found him again. 3 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, moved with brutal efficiency. One held the terrified townsfolk at bay, with a Colt Peacemaker, its barrels sweeping across the room like a grim pendulum. Another was behind the counter stuffing wads of cash into a canvas sack. The third, the leader, stood near the door, barking orders in a low, controlled voice that promised violence more effectively than any shout. Jacob's hand twitched instinctively, reaching for the Colt that no longer hung at his hip. He was a rancher now, not a lawman. His gun was back at his small homestead, oiled and holstered, but unused, a relic of a life he had buried along with his wife, Elena. He was a ghost in his own life, and ghosts didn't get involved. He kept his head down, focusing on the scuffed floorboards, counting the seconds until it was over. "Move it, we ain't got all day," the leader snarled. The man behind the counter, clumsy in his haste, stumbled as he vaulted back over. The canvas sack snagged, spilling greenbacks and coins across the floor. As he scrambled to gather the money, something small and silver slipped from his vest pocket, clattering onto the boards with a delicate metallic chime that cut through the noise. It was a locket. A small heart-shaped silver locket, tarnished with age and engraved with the faint outline of a climbing rose. The world went silent for Jacob. The shouts of the robbers, the whimpers of the hostages, the frantic ticking of the wall clock, it all faded into a dull roar. He knew that locket. He had held it in his hand 1,000 times. He had watched Elena fasten its delicate chain around her neck every morning. It was identical to the one she had been wearing on the day the stagecoach was ambushed, the day she was torn from his life. The locket he had insisted be buried with her, a final token of a love that had been his only anchor. His breath hitched in his chest. It couldn't be. A coincidence. A cruel trick of the light and a grieving mind. But as the robber snatched the locket from the floor, and the faint morning light caught the small distinctive dent near the clasp, a dent made when a 2-year-old Elena had dropped it on the stone hearth of her childhood home, a story she had told him on their wedding night. It was hers. The blood drained from Jacob's face, replaced by an icy resolve that had lain dormant for 5 years. This was not a coincidence. This was a desecration. A thread from his buried past, pulled taut and leading directly to this violent, sordid moment. The careful walls he had built around his grief crumbled into dust. The ghost was gone. The marshal was back. The leader shoved the last of the money into the sack. "Let's go." As the robbers backed toward the door, using the bank manager as a shield, Jacob moved. He didn't think. He reacted. He lunged from behind the desk, grabbing a heavy inkwell from its surface. With a flick of his wrist, honed by years of practice, he hurled it. The inkwell spun through the air and smashed into the gun hand of the man holding the locket. The robber cried out, his pistol clattering to the floor as his fingers went numb. The silver locket flew from his grasp, landing near the doorway. The leader spun his eyes, finding Jacob instantly. He raised his Colt. Time slowed. Jacob saw the hammer pull back the dark, unblinking eye of the barrel. He threw himself sideways, a bullet splintering the floor where he'd been standing. The other robber opened fire, and the room erupted in a storm of lead and screaming. Jacob scrambled for the fallen pistol, his fingers closing around the cool metal of its grip. It felt impossibly familiar, an extension of his own will. He came up on one knee, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The shot was clean precise. The second robber grunted and staggered back, clutching a wound in his shoulder. The leader was already at the door, dragging the bank manager with him. "Forget the money ride," he yelled to his wounded man. He fired one last shot into the ceiling to cover their escape, the plaster raining down like snow. Jacob ignored them. His eyes were fixed on the locket lying abandoned on the floor. As the wounded robber stumbled out the door, Jacob fired again, not at the man, but at the swinging doors of the bank. His shot was aimed high, a warning, a promise. But his focus was singular. He crawled toward the locket, his hand shaking as he reached for it. The silver was cool against his palm. He thumbed the clasp. It opened. Inside, the tiny, faded portrait of a young woman with dark, laughing eyes stared back at him. Elena. On the other side, a matching empty space where his own portrait should have been. It had fallen out years ago, but she had never replaced it, saying she preferred to see her own reflection there, next to his memory. He snapped it shut, his knuckles white. The official report had called it a robbery gone wrong. A tragic, random act of violence on a lonely stretch of road. But random robbers didn't desecrate graves. They didn't steal keepsakes from the dead. The story of Elena's death was a lie. And the man who just dropped this locket held the beginning of the truth. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the dusty streets of Redemption, Jacob knew his quiet life was over. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a man with a question, and he would tear the world apart to find the answer. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the jagged mesas in hues of blood and rust. Jacob's ranch was a lonely speck in the vast, unforgiving landscape, a testament to his 5-year penance. The small cabin was neat but empty, holding only the functional necessities of a man who took no joy in living. A single photograph of Elena sat on the mantelpiece, its silver frame gathering a thin layer of dust that he could never bring himself to wipe away. In the picture, she was laughing, her head thrown back, the silver locket, a bright star against the dark fabric of her dress. He had been a famed marshal, a name whispered with respect and fear from the dusty plains of Kansas to the mountains of Colorado. Jacob Thorne, the man who always brought his target in, dead or alive. His reputation was built on a foundation of cold nerve and unwavering resolve. But when Elena died, that foundation had turned to sand. The investigation into the stagecoach ambush had been swift and, to his mind, incomplete. The local sheriff concluded it was a common road gang spooked into violence. They were never caught. Jacob, consumed by a grief that was a physical weight in his chest, had accepted the story. The guilt was his true burden. As the marshal responsible for the territory, he had failed to keep the roads safe. He had failed her. He resigned his commission, trading his badge for a branding iron and the silent company of cattle. He had sought oblivion in Redemption, and for 5 years he had found it. Now, sitting at his simple wooden table, the locket a cold weight in his palm, and the oblivion was shattered. The past was not dead. It had been waiting. The next morning, he rode into Redemption. The town was still buzzing with talk of the robbery. Dust devils danced across the cracked earth like restless spirits. The saloon doors creaked on their hinges, and the tired faces of the townsfolk watched him pass with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He bypassed the sheriff's office, heading instead for the small clapboard building that housed the doctor. Inside, the smell of carbolic acid and stale coffee hung in the air. Doc Miller, a kind man with weary eyes and hands stained by his trade, was tending to the wounded bank robber who was moaning on a cot. "He'll live, Jacob," the doctor said without looking up. "Though I doubt he'll be grateful for it once Sheriff Thompson is through with him." I need to talk to him. Jacob set his voice a low rasp. The doctor finally looked at him, his gaze sharp. He took in Jacob's face, the hard set of his jaw, the fire smoldering in his eyes, and seemed to understand that a fundamental shift had occurred. He's lost a lot of blood. Not much for conversation. He'll talk, Jacob said, stepping toward the cot. He knelt beside the robber, a young man with fear sweat beading on his brow. Jacob opened his hand, revealing the silver locket. The man's eyes widened in recognition, then darted away. This was my wife's. Jacob said, his voice dangerously soft. She was buried with it 5 years ago. Now you're going to tell me where you got it. The robber shook his head, muttering, "Don't know nothing." Jacob's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wounded shoulder. The robber screamed, his body arching in pain. I won't ask again. Jacob set his face inches from the man's. All right, all right. The man gasped, tears of pain tracking through the grime on his face. We was told to dig it up, a test he called it, to see if we had the stomach for the work. Told by who? Jacob's grip tightened. Blackwood, the man choked out. Silas Blackwood. The name was new to Jacob. It meant nothing. Who is he? Big man, rich, buying up land all over the territory. Says he's building an empire. He hired us on a month back, said he had a special interest in this town, in you. The last 2 words struck Jacob like a physical blow. In him. Why me? I don't know, the man cried. He said Jacob Thorne owed him a debt, and he was here to collect. Jacob released the man, his mind reeling. Silas Blackwood. A man he'd never heard of, believed he was owed a debt. A debt connected to a locket stolen from his wife's grave. The pieces didn't fit. They formed a picture of something far more personal and twisted than a simple bank robbery. He walked out of the doctor's office into the harsh light of day, the locket clutched in his fist. He went straight to his ranch. From the bottom of an old wooden trunk buried beneath clothes he hadn't worn in years, he pulled out a worn leather gun belt. The Colt felt heavy and right in his hand. He strapped it on. Then from a small velvet pouch he took out a tarnished silver star, a U.S. Marshal's badge. The metal was cold against his palm, a chilling reminder of the man he used to be, the man he had to become again. He pinned it to his vest. The weight of it was both a burden and a release. The quiet years were over. Jacob Thorne was hunting again. Sheriff Thompson's office was a cramped space that smelled of stale cigar smoke and desperation. Thompson himself was a man worn down by the job, his face a roadmap of weary lines, his belly straining the buttons of his vest. He looked up from his paperwork as Jacob entered, his eyes immediately fixing on the star on Jacob's chest. I heard you were playing the hero at the bank, Thompson said, his tone laced with disapproval. I didn't hear you were playing Marshal again. Just borrowing the authority. Jacob set his voice flat. He placed the silver locket on the sheriff's desk. The man you have in the doc's office. He dropped this. It was my wife's. Thompson picked up the locket, turning it over in his thick fingers. I know. The whole town knows the story of Elena's locket. So this was a grave robbery, too. They dug her up on orders, Jacob explained, from a man named Silas Blackwood. The sheriff's expression soured. Blackwood. I was afraid he was involved. He's been buying up ranches from folks who've had accidents. Fires, spooked herds, wells gone dry. No one can prove anything, but everyone knows it's him. He's squeezing this territory like a vice. My man says Blackwood's interested in me, Jacob stated. Says I owe him a debt. Thompson sighed, leaning back in his chair until it groaned in protest. Look, Jacob, I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry they desecrated her grave. But Blackwood is a different kind of animal. He's got money men and lawyers. He's wrapped up so tight in legal paper I can't touch him. You going after him with that badge, that's not just reckless, it's suicidal. I'm not asking for your permission. Then what are you asking for? Information. Where can I find him? The sheriff hesitated, then seemed to decide it was better to point a loaded gun than to let it fire randomly. He bought the old Cimarron spread north of here, turned it into a fortress, but you won't get within a mile of it without his men spotting you. As Jacob turned to leave, a young, eager voice stopped him. Marshal Thorne. Jacob looked toward the corner of the office, where a young deputy sat polishing a rifle. He couldn't have been more than 20 with a face that hadn't yet learned to hide its earnestness. The name on his badge read, Miller. I'm Deputy Miller, sir. Eli Miller, the young man said, standing up, his admiration shining in his eyes. I've read about you. The Stockton gang, the raid on Hangman's Pass. It's an honor, sir. Jacob just nodded, his face unreadable. He had no time for hero worship. Sheriff, Eli said, turning to his boss. If Marshal Thorne is investigating Blackwood, maybe I could assist him. I know the territory, and... You'll do your job, Deputy Thompson cut him off sharply. Which is to file that paperwork and stay out of matters that don't concern you. Jacob Thorne is a ghost. Let him hunt his own kind. Jacob left without another word. He knew Thompson was right. This was a fool's errand. But the cold weight of the locket in his pocket was a constant reminder that he had no other choice. His investigation began not with Blackwood, but with the people his shadow had touched. He rode from ranch to ranch, his badge earning him entry where a simple rancher would have been turned away. The stories were all the same. A rancher who refused to sell his land found his prize bull dead, his fences cut. A widow was offered a pittance for her property, and when she declined, her barn burned to the ground the next night. The townsfolk were terrified. They spoke in whispers, their eyes darting toward the horizon, as if expecting Blackwood's men to appear at any moment. No one would speak on the record. Fear was a gag in their mouths. Jacob knew he had to get closer. He spent 2 days tracking the gang from the bank robbery. Their trail was sloppy, but it led east toward a series of rocky canyons that were a perfect hideout. Using the skills that had been his trade for a decade, he moved like a phantom through the broken land, climbing ridges and using the terrain for cover. He found their camp at dusk, tucked into a box canyon. 4 men sat around a low fire, their voices carrying on the still evening air. Jacob settled behind a rocky outcrop, his rifle resting on the stone, and listened. They weren't talking about the robbery. They were complaining about their employer. Blackwood's gone crazy. One of them grumbled. First, he has us dig up a grave for a trinket. Now he's got us waiting out here for a ghost. I signed on to rustle cattle, not play nursemaid to his obsession. He pays well, another countered. And all we have to do is wait for Thorne to come sniffing. A third man, the leader from the bank, spoke up. Blackwood wants him alive. He was real clear about that. Says killing him would be too quick a mercy. The words sent a chill down Jacob's spine. This wasn't about land or money. This was a vendetta. Blackwood wasn't just trying to intimidate him. He was setting a trap, using his own men as bait. Jacob raised his rifle, the setting sun glinting off the long barrel. He could end this right here, take them all down. But they were just pawns. The King Silas Blackwood was still safe in his castle. He needed answers, and dead men couldn't provide them. He lowered the rifle, backing away as silently as he had come. He had learned what he needed to. Blackwood was expecting him. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a duel, and his opponent had already made the first move. Jacob spent the next week gathering string, pulling at the frayed edges of Blackwood's empire. He learned that Blackwood had arrived in the territory 6 years ago, a year before Elena's death, buying a small failing ranch. For years he'd kept a low profile, a quiet gentleman rancher. Then about a year ago, he had started his aggressive expansion, his operations fueled by a sudden influx of cash from back east. It was a pattern Jacob had seen before, a predator patiently circling its prey before moving in for the kill. He found an unlikely and persistent ally in Deputy Eli Miller. The young man, defying the sheriff's orders, would find Jacob on the trail, bringing him coffee food and snippets of information he'd gleaned from town. The telegraph operator says Blackwood gets a wire from St. Louis every Thursday. Eli would report, his face flushed with the excitement of the chase. And the stable boy told me Blackwood's men ride mounts from a specific breeder in Kentucky. They're military grade. Jacob was initially gruff and dismissive, but Eli's earnest competence and unwavering belief in the legend of Jacob Thorne began to wear down his defenses. The boy was a good tracker and had a sharp eye. More than that, he was a reminder of the kind of clear-eyed belief in justice Jacob himself had once possessed. "Why are you doing this, kid?" Jacob asked him one evening as they shared a small fire under a canopy of stars. "The sheriff told you to stand down. Because what Blackwood is doing is wrong," Eli said simply. "And because no one else has the guts to stop him. You do. I want to be a part of that." He looked at Jacob, his expression serious. "My father was a lawman. He used to tell me that a badge isn't just a piece of tin. It's a promise. You're keeping your promise, Marshal. I want to keep mine." Jacob didn't respond, but a reluctant respect for the young deputy began to take root. As he dug deeper, his own mind became a source of torment. The investigation forced him to revisit the day of the ambush, to walk through the landscape of his worst memories. The flashbacks came more frequently, now sharp and vivid. He remembered the crack of the first shot, the splintering of the stagecoach door, Elena's scream. But other, more confusing fragments began to surface. He recalled another sound, a high-pitched wail that he had dismissed at the time as the wind. A child's cry, and another woman's scream, one of terror that was not Elena's melodic voice. He remembered the chaos of the gunfight, his posse returning fire into the trees where the ambushers were hidden. He remembered kneeling beside Elena's body, the world dissolving into a haze of grief. But now in his dreams, he saw something else in the periphery. A flash of a calico dress, a small, overturned wagon, half hidden in the brush just off the road. He had suppressed these details, his mind shielding him from anything that wasn't the focal point of his tragedy. But now, they returned insistent and unsettling. One afternoon, Eli found him poring over the old case file from the ambush, which he'd unofficially requested from the territorial archives. "Find anything, Marshal?" "Ghosts," Jacob muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. He pointed to a line in his own report. "I wrote here 2 ambushers, possibly more. But the posse only reported seeing 2 men." "Maybe you saw something in the confusion," Eli suggested. Maybe. Jacob's mind latched onto the memory of the half-hidden wagon. "Eli, how long would it take to get a message to the marshal's office in Prescott?" "A few days by telegraph. Why?" "I want to know if there were any reports of a missing family in this territory around the time of the ambush. A man, a woman, and a child. Maybe traveling in a small farm wagon." Eli nodded, understanding the gravity of the request. "I'll send the wire myself. I'll tell them it's official business." While he waited for a response, Jacob knew he needed a more direct approach. He needed to get his hands on one of Blackwood's inner circle. His chance came 3 nights later. He learned from Eli that one of Blackwood's foremen, a ruthless man named Carter, was riding into Redemption for supplies and women. Jacob waited in the shadows of the alley behind the saloon. He listened to the raucous piano music and drunken laughter, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Just after midnight, Carter stumbled out, reeking of cheap whiskey. Jacob stepped out of the shadows, his pistol leveled. "We need to talk," Jacob said. Carter, drunk but not stupid, went for his gun. Jacob was faster. He pistol-whipped Carter across the temple, sending the big man crumpling to the ground. He dragged him into the darkness of the livery stable. When Carter came to, he was tied to a support beam, his head throbbing. Jacob stood before him, his face a mask of cold fury. In his hand, he held a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird. "I found this near the Johnson Ranch." Jacob said, his voice a low growl. "After your men burned his barn. It looks like a child's toy." "Why would your men be carrying a child's toy?" Carter spat on the ground. "Go to hell, Thorne." Jacob backhanded him, the sound sharp in the quiet stable. "Silas Blackwood. Why does he want me?" Carter just laughed, a broken, bloody sound. "You really don't know, do you? He picked you clean 5 years ago, and you still don't even know his name." The words hit Jacob with the force of a physical blow. He was there at the ambush. He was the ambush. Carter sneered. "And you were the marshal who rode in with guns blazing, the great Jacob Thorne saving the day." His voice dripped with bitter irony. "Tell me, Marshal, how many bodies did your posse leave behind that day?" The fragmented memories crashed into place, the child's cry, the other woman's scream, the hidden wagon. There was another family there. Jacob whispered, the realization dawning in horror. Carter's smile was triumphant and cruel. "Now you're getting it. He wasn't just some road agent. He was a desperate man. And you took everything from him. So he decided to take everything from you." Jacob felt the floor give way beneath him. The locket wasn't just a trophy. It was a message. A symbol of a shared horrific past. "And the locket," Jacob forced the words out. Carter's eyes glinted. "He has the other half. Wears it under his shirt. A reminder, he says, of the day his life ended, and the day his war with you began." Jacob stared at the foreman, the pieces of the puzzle falling into a monstrous picture. This wasn't a vendetta over a perceived debt. This was revenge. Silas Blackwood was the man from the stagecoach ambush. And in the crossfire that had killed Elena, Jacob had unwittingly destroyed Blackwood's world as well. The fight wasn't about land or money or power. It was about 2 men bound together by a tragedy that had left them both shattered, each holding one half of a broken heart. The revelation hit Jacob with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't hunting a monster. He was hunting a mirror image of his own grief. A man forged in the same fire that had consumed his own life. The knowledge didn't bring clarity. It brought a chilling, profound sense of dread. Silas Blackwood would never negotiate. He would never surrender. This would only end when one of them was in the ground. He left Carter tied up for the sheriff and rode out of town the cold desert night, offering no comfort. He now understood the deliberate cruelty of Blackwood's actions. Desecrating Elena's grave wasn't just a taunt. It was an act of reciprocity. An eye for an eye, a grave for a grave. His new understanding of the stakes was confirmed the next day. As he rode back towards Redemption, he saw a pillar of smoke rising from the direction of his ranch. He spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart pounding with a familiar, sickening rhythm. He arrived to find his small cabin engulfed in flames, the roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. The hay in his barn was ablaze, and his small herd of cattle had been scattered some shot where they stood. They hadn't just destroyed his home. They had erased his 5 years of peace, burning his sanctuary to the ground. On the gatepost, a piece of paper was nailed with a bowie knife. On it, a single elegantly scripted word, soon. Blackwood was tightening the noose. Jacob was now a man with nothing left to lose, which was exactly where Silas wanted him. He rode into Redemption, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes. He went straight to the sheriff's office. "He burned me out." Jacob said, his voice devoid of emotion. Thompson looked at the smoke stain on the horizon, his face grim. "I'm sorry, Jacob." "I need you to deputize a posse," Jacob demanded. "We're going after him, now." "On what grounds?" The sheriff countered, his voice weary. "You have the word of a drunken foreman and a fire with no witnesses. Blackwood will say it was lightning or a stray ember. His lawyers will tie us up in knots for years." "So you're going to do nothing?" Jacob's voice rose laced with fury. "I'm going to uphold the law," Thompson said firmly. "Which means I need proof. You go after him like this, you're no better than he is. You'll be a vigilante, a fugitive. I'll have to issue a warrant for your arrest." Before Jacob could argue, Eli Miller burst into the office, a telegraph slip in his hand. His face was pale. "Marshal, the wire from Prescott came back." He handed the slip to Jacob. Jacob read the terse message. It confirmed his worst fears. 5 years ago, a family of 3, Silas, Sarah, and Daniel Blackwood, had been reported missing. They were last seen heading west on the same road as Elena's stagecoach, their intended destination, a small plot of land they had just purchased. They were never heard from again. He handed the telegraph to Sheriff Thompson. "There's your proof. Blackwood was there. He lost his family the same day I lost my wife." Thompson read the slip, his expression hardening. But his resolve didn't change. "This proves he was in the area. It doesn't prove he led the ambush or that he burned your ranch. It's still just your word against his." Suddenly, the door to the office flew open. 2 of Blackwood's men stood there, flanking a well-dressed man in a city suit. "Sheriff Thompson," the lawyer said smoothly. "I am here on behalf of my client, Mr. Silas Blackwood. He wishes to file a complaint against this man." He pointed a manicured finger at Jacob. "For assault and kidnapping of his employee, Mr. Carter." Thompson's face went grim. "Jacob." "He's tied up in your livery," Jacob said flatly. Blackwood was turning the tables, using the very law Jacob once represented as a weapon against him. While they argued, Jacob's eyes met Eli's. The young deputy looked torn between his duty to the sheriff and his loyalty to Jacob. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, "Several upstanding citizens are prepared to testify that Mr. Thorne was seen riding from his ranch just before the fire started. My client is a respected landowner, and he is deeply concerned that this unhinged individual poses a threat to the community. It was a perfectly executed trap. Blackwood was painting him as a crazed vigilante, a man spiraling into violence after a personal tragedy. Jacob was being isolated, stripped of his credibility and his allies. He was becoming a fugitive in his own hunt." He looked at the sheriff, then at the lawyer, and knew he had lost this fight. He turned and walked out of the office, ignoring Thompson's call for him to stop. He was on his own now. He went to the one person he thought he could still trust, Doc Miller. He found the doctor in his office preparing a poultice. "They're turning the town against me," Jacob said, pacing the small room. "I heard," the doctor said, not looking up from his work. "Silas Blackwood has a long reach, Jacob, and a deep pocket. I need a place to lie low for a day or two to think," Jacob said. "Can I trust you, Doc?" Doc Miller finally looked up, his eyes filled with a sad sympathy. "My wife, Martha, her lungs are failing. The doctors back east say there's an experimental treatment, but it costs a fortune. More than a small-town doctor could ever make." He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "Blackwood found out. He's paying for everything. The best doctors that travel. He's promised me she'll get the care she needs." The betrayal was quiet, delivered not with malice, but with a weary, heartbreaking resignation. Jacob felt the last of his anchors give way. "So you told him?" Jacob stated, the realization dawning. "Everything I told you." "I'm sorry, Jacob," the doctor whispered, his eyes pleading for an understanding Jacob couldn't give. "He has my wife's life in his hands. What would you do?" Jacob didn't answer. He turned and walked away, the doctor's question echoing in the empty space where his trust used to be. He was truly alone now, hunted by the law, betrayed by his friends, with no home to return to. He was a ghost once more. But this time, he was a ghost with a gun. As he slipped out of town, he saw the new wanted posters going up. His own face stared back at him. The words, "Wanted for arson and kidnapping," printed in bold letters beneath. His only remaining ally was a young deputy who would soon be ordered to hunt him down. Blackwood had taken everything. Now only the final confrontation remained. The sandstorm hit without warning, a roiling wall of dust and fury that turned the midday sun to a bruised twilight. It howled across the plains like a vengeful spirit tearing at the fabric of the world. For Jacob, it was the perfect cover. He rode hunched low over his horse's neck, the wind whipping at his face, the grit stinging his eyes. He was heading for the one place he knew this had to end, and the abandoned church of San Augustine, a decaying adobe ruin that stood alone on a high mesa, a forgotten monument to a faith that had long since departed the harsh land. He had sent a message to Silas Blackwood via Eli, a simple challenge whispered in the dead of night at the edge of town. The deputy, his loyalty to Jacob overriding his duty, had agreed to be the go-between. The old church, sunset. Come alone. Jacob knew Blackwood wouldn't come alone, but he also knew the man's pride wouldn't allow him to refuse a direct challenge. As he neared the church, its skeletal bell tower materialized out of the swirling dust. The wind screamed through the empty windows, and the old iron bell swung erratically on its rusted fitting, its clapper, striking at random intervals a dissonant tolling clock, counting down to a final judgment. Jacob dismounted, securing his horse in the relative shelter of a crumbling wall. He slipped inside the church, his boots silent on the sand-dusted floor. Light filtered through the broken, grimy stained glass windows, casting shifting, distorted patterns of color on the decaying pews and the fallen crucifix at the far end of the nave. The air was thick with the ghosts of forgotten prayers and the raw, elemental power of the storm. He didn't have to wait long. A voice eloquent and laced with cold menace echoed from the doorway, cutting through the howl of the wind. An appropriate venue, Marshal. A house of God for a final confession. Silas Blackwood stepped inside, flanked by two of his men. He was a tall man, dressed not in trail clothes, but in a tailored black coat as if attending a funeral. His face was intelligent, his features handsome but twisted by a grief that had hardened into something cold and sharp. He held a Winchester rifle loosely in his hands. He gestured for his men to stay at the door. "I asked you to come alone," Jacob said, his voice flat. He stood near the altar, a shadow among shadows. And I asked for the truth 5 years ago and was handed a lie. Silas countered, his voice resonating in the cavernous space. Trust, you will find, is the first casualty of tragedy. The wind gusted, sending a cascade of dust and debris from the ceiling. The bell tolled a frantic, chaotic rhythm. This ends tonight, Blackwood. It ended 5 years ago, Thorn. Silas said, taking a slow step forward. Tonight is merely the epilogue. He began to walk down the central aisle, his boots crunching on the shattered glass. Do you know what today is? It's my son's birthday. Daniel. He would have been 10. He had my wife's eyes and a laugh that could charm the devil himself. He stopped, his eyes locking with Jacob's across the dusty expanse. We were coming here to start a new life. We had bought a small piece of land, a place to build a home. We had everything. Our wagon broke an axle just off the road. I was trying to fix it when your stagecoach came through. The pain in his voice was raw, a living thing. It wasn't a robbery, not at first. Just two desperate men who thought they could get enough money to feed their families. But it went wrong. Someone on the coach fired. Then your posse arrived and the world exploded. You were the marshal in charge, Thorn. Your men fired blindly into the woods. He raised his voice over a sudden shriek of wind. A stray shot. That's what the coroner would have called it. A stray shot from one of your deputies' rifles went through the canvas of our wagon. It killed my Sarah instantly. My Daniel. He bled to death in my arms while I tried to quiet his crying so your men wouldn't find us. The confession hung in the air, more devastating than any gunshot. Jacob felt the weight of it crush him. The child's cry he remembered. It was Daniel dying. I watched you. Silas continued, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. I watched you kneel beside your wife's body, and I felt nothing but hate. You lost one person. I lost my entire world. And you, the great lawman, you wrote it all off as a random tragedy and moved on. I didn't move on. Jacob rasped the words tearing from his throat. I died that day too. I know. Silas hissed, raising his rifle. You just went to sleep. I am here to wake you up. He fired. Jacob dove behind the stone altar as the shot ricocheted, sending stone chips flying. The battle began. It was a brutal, intimate dance of death among the decaying pews. The storm raged outside, mirroring their internal turmoil. Dust obscured their vision, and the shifting shadows played tricks on the eye. Jacob moved with the lethal grace of his former life, but his heart wasn't in it. Every shot he fired felt like an admission of guilt. He saw a movement near the door and fired, but it wasn't one of Silas's men. It was Eli Miller, clutching a rifle, his face set with grim determination. Eli, get out of here, Jacob yelled. Not leaving you, Marshal. The young deputy shouted back, taking cover and firing toward Silas's men at the door. The fight escalated, a three-way conflict in the heart of the storm. Jacob gained the upper hand on Silas, tackling him to the ground, the rifle skittering away. They wrestled in the dust, two men fueled by 5 years of grief and rage. Jacob's hands closed around Silas's throat. Suddenly, a shot rang out closer than the others. Eli cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Standing over him, a pistol in his shaking hand, was Doc Miller. I'm sorry, Jacob. The doctor cried, his face a mask of anguish. He has my wife. Silas used the distraction to break free, scrambling for his rifle. The betrayal was absolute. Jacob was caught between his wounded ally, his secret enemy, and the man he had come to kill. He made a choice. He ignored Silas and charged the doctor not with rage, but with a desperate plea in his eyes. He slammed into Miller, sending the pistol flying, and grabbed the front of his coat. Is this what she would want, Doc, another man's family destroyed for her sake? The doctor stared at him, his resolve crumbling. Tears streamed down his face. No, he sobbed. No. Silas raised his rifle, aiming at Jacob's back. It's over, Thorne. A shot cracked through the church, not from Silas's rifle. Silas looked down in surprise at the red flower blooming on his chest. Behind him, Eli Miller propped up on one elbow. Smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol lowered his gun. Silas staggered, a look of profound shock on his face. He dropped his rifle and sank to his knees, his eyes finding Jacob's. He would have been 10. He whispered a final, heartbreaking testament. Then he collapsed onto the dusty floor, his war finally over. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. The wind died to a mournful sigh, and a sliver of the setting sun pierced through the clouds, sending a single golden beam of light through the shattered stained glass window. It illuminated the scene in the church like a stage play at its tragic conclusion. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling around the 3 living men and the one who lay still upon the floor. Jacob knelt beside Silas Blackwood, his fingers searching for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The man's eyes were open, staring up at the decaying ceiling as if seeing something far beyond it. Jacob gently closed them. The war was over, but there was no sense of victory, only a profound and hollow emptiness. He had not won. They had both lost 5 years ago on a dusty road under a summer sun. He retrieved the locket from his own pocket. Then, reaching under Silas's coat, he found the chain around the man's neck. He pulled it free. There in his palm lay the other half of the heart, a matching silver locket engraved with the same climbing rose. He opened it. Inside was a portrait of a smiling woman with kind eyes, and in the other space, a tiny, serious-faced boy. Sarah and Daniel. He snapped both lockets shut, the weight of their combined tragedy heavy in his hands. Marshall. Eli's voice was weak. Jacob rushed to his side. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his thigh. It was a painful wound, but not a fatal one. You saved my life, Eli. Jacob said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, gratitude. That's my job, the deputy said, gritting his teeth against the pain. Keeping promises. Jacob looked over at Doc Miller, who stood weeping silently near the altar, a broken man. There was no anger left in Jacob, only a deep, weary pity. He tore a strip of cloth from a discarded altar tapestry and began to fashion a tourniquet for Eli's leg. Help me with him, Doc. Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. The doctor started, then shuffled forward, his medical instincts taking over. Together, they bandaged Eli's wound and fashioned a crude splint. They worked in silence, the only sounds the drip of water from the leaking roof and the soft groans of the wounded deputy. When they were done, Sheriff Thompson arrived with a posse drawn by the sound of the gunshots echoing across the plains as the storm had subsided. He took in the scene, Silas's body, the wounded deputy, the disgraced doctor, and looked at Jacob, his face a mixture of exhaustion and grudging respect. It's over then, the sheriff stated. It wasn't a question. It's over, Jacob confirmed. He explained everything, the shared tragedy, Silas's revenge, the doctor's betrayal. He left nothing out. When he was finished, Thompson walked over to Doc Miller. He didn't yell or condemn. He simply unpinned the doctor's civic service medal from his coat and put it in his own pocket. You'll face a territorial judge for this, Henry. Thompson said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Aiding and abetting. The doctor just nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The posse carried Eli out to a wagon. As they passed Jacob, the young deputy reached out a hand. Jacob took it. "You're a good man, Eli Miller," Jacob said. "You'll make a fine sheriff one day." Eli managed a weak smile. "Learned from the best, Marshal." Jacob was cleared of all charges. The town of Redemption was safe. The shadow of Silas Blackwood was gone. But as Jacob rode away from the church, leaving the sheriff to clean up the aftermath, the victory felt as empty as the desert sky. He had found the truth, but the truth had offered no peace, only a deeper understanding of his own role in the cycle of pain. He was no hero. He was just a survivor. Weeks passed. The raw wounds of redemption began to scar over. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold and amber. Eli Miller was recovering his limp, a permanent reminder of the day he kept his promise. Doc Miller was awaiting trial, his wife Martha having passed away peacefully in her sleep, a week after the shootout, rendering his terrible bargain moot. The town, free from Blackwood's grip, was slowly breathing again. Jacob had not rebuilt his cabin. He lived out of a room at the boarding house, his few possessions gathered in a single saddlebag. He had done what he came to do. The ghosts were answered, if not silenced. There was nothing left for him here. One clear, cool morning, he saddled his horse. He had one last journey to make. He rode for hours, leaving the town behind, heading into the familiar lonely hills where the ambush had taken place. He didn't need a map. The place was burned into his memory. He found the spot easily. A quiet clearing of sun-dappled grass just off the old road. Time had softened the edges of the tragedy. Wildflowers grew where the ground had been scarred by hoofprints and gunfire. Near a cluster of old oaks, he found what he was looking for. Two weathered crosses stood side by side. One, which he had carved himself 5 years ago, was marked with a simple name, Elena. The other was newer, its wood still pale against the elements. It bore 2 names, Sarah and Daniel Blackwood. Silas must have put it there sometime in the last few years, a secret memorial in the heart of his enemy's territory. Jacob dismounted. He stood before the graves for a long time, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. These 2 families, intertwined by a single violent moment, were now united in the quiet earth. He took the 2 silver lockets from his pocket. He held one half in each hand, the metal warmed by the morning sun. Then with a quiet click, he joined them together, making the broken heart whole again. He knelt and gently placed the complete, perfect locket on the earth, nestled between the 2 crosses. It was not an act of forgiveness, for he didn't know if he was capable of that. It was an act of acknowledgement, a final admission of their shared, unbearable loss. He was letting go not of Elena, but of the guilt and rage that had defined him for so long. As he stood to leave, he heard the sound of an approaching horse. He turned to see Eli Miller riding toward him, his legs still stiff, but his seat in the saddle firm. The young deputy swung down from his horse, his face serious. "Sheriff Thompson is retiring," Eli said, coming to stand beside him. "The town council asked me to take his place." "You'll do a fine job," Jacob said, meaning it. "I will," Eli agreed. "But the territory needs more than one good man. It needs a marshal." He reached into his coat, pulled out a familiar silver-starred Jacob's badge. "Thompson held on to this for you. He said to give it back when the time was right." Eli held out the badge. Jacob looked at it, the silver gleaming in the sun. For 5 years it had been a symbol of his greatest failure, a reminder of the life he had lost, the promise he had broken. He looked at the 2 graves, at the single whole locket resting between them. He looked at Eli's earnest, hopeful face. He looked out at the vast horizon, a future he had never expected to have, stretching out before him. A faint, sad smile touched Jacob's lips. He reached out and took the badge from Eli's hand. It felt different now. Not heavy with the past, but light with the possibility of a future. A future where justice wasn't about vengeance, but about protecting others from the kind of tragedy that had shaped his life. He pinned the star to his vest. It settled into place, feeling like it had finally come home,